They said a black woman couldn't outsmart the system, couldn't build an empire of freedom right under the slaveholders' noses. But Mary Meachum proved them dead wrong, and her ferry across the Mississippi became the most dangerous ride to liberation that Missouri had ever seen. Before we dive into this incredible true story of courage and resistance, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another story of black excellence and survival. These are the histories they never taught us in school, and you need to hear every single one. The woman who refused to be broken. The summer of 1815 brought Mary into this world not as a person, but as property, a distinction she would spend her entire life fighting to erase. Born enslaved in Kentucky, Mary's earliest memories weren't of childhood games or maternal warmth, but of watching her mother's hands crack and bleed in the fields, of seeing her father's back marked with scars that told stories his mouth was forbidden to speak. The plantation where she took her first breath was a place where humanity went to die, where black bodies were counted alongside livestock, where children learned before they could walk that their lives belonged to someone else. Yet even in that crucible of oppression, something unbreakable was forming inside young Mary, a determination that would one day ferry hundreds to freedom. Mary's mind was sharp as cut glass, observing everything, forgetting nothing. While other children might have been broken by the casual cruelties of enslavement, Mary catalogued them, studied them, searched for weaknesses in the system that held her captive. She watched how the overseers moved when they drank, where they weren't looking. She noticed which slaves the master trusted, which ones he feared, and most importantly, which ones he underestimated. By the age of 10, Mary had already learned the most valuable lesson of her life. White people's arrogance was their greatest vulnerability, and a black woman's invisibility could become her most powerful weapon. The fields of Kentucky were where Mary's body labored, but her mind was always elsewhere, calculating, planning, dreaming of a freedom that seemed as distant as the stars. She picked cotton until her fingers bled, but while her hands worked, her ears listened to every conversation, every rumor, every whispered word about the territories to the west where slavery's grip was supposedly weaker. She heard tell of a place called Missouri, where some black people, just some, precious few, had managed to purchase their freedom, to build lives that resembled something almost human. It wasn't much, but it was more than Kentucky offered, and Mary tucked that information away like a seed she would one day plant. But what would it take for her to reach that distant shore, and would she survive the journey? The year 1834 marked a turning point that would reshape Mary's entire existence. At 19 years old, she caught the attention of a man named Mary Meachum, a free black man who had done the impossible. John had been born enslaved just like Mary, but through years of backbreaking work as a carpenter and cooper, he had saved enough money to purchase his own freedom, then his father's freedom, and then the freedom of the woman who would become his first wife. By the time Mary met him, John was already a legend in the black community, a man who had transformed himself from property into proprietor, who owned land and ran a business, and stood as living proof that the slaveholders' lies about black inferiority were just that. Lies. John saw in Mary what the slaveholders couldn't. Her brilliant mind, her unshakable will, her potential not just to be free, but to free others. Their courtship was conducted in the shadows, in stolen moments between Mary's endless labor and John's careful maneuvering through a world that wanted him dead or re-enslaved at every turn. When John offered to purchase Mary's freedom, it wasn't just an act of love. It was a strategic alliance, a partnership between two brilliant tacticians who understood that individual freedom meant nothing if their people remained in chains. The negotiation for Mary's liberty took months, required every dollar John had saved and borrowed, demanded humiliating prostrations before white men who couldn't comprehend that this black man had outsmarted them all. But in 1834, Mary Meachum became a free woman, and the slaveholding South would never know what hit them. Freedom tasted different than Mary had imagined. It was sweeter, but also heavier, weighted with the knowledge of all those still suffering. She and John settled in St. Louis, Missouri, a city perched on the edge of everything, where the Mississippi River divided slave states from territories where freedom was at least theoretically possible. St. Louis was a cauldron of contradictions, a place where free black people ran businesses while enslaved people were sold on auction blocks, where fortunes were made on the backs of human cargo flowing up and down the great river. Mary watched it all with those same calculating eyes that had served her so well in Kentucky, and she began to see not just what was, but what could be. John established himself as a prominent member of St. Louis's free black community, opening a cooperative and later founding the First African Baptist Church, which would become so much more than a place of worship. Mary worked beside him, but she was building something else, something quieter and infinitely more dangerous. She opened a school for black children in the basement of their home, teaching reading and writing and mathematics to students both free and enslaved, in direct violation of Missouri laws that forbade educating black people. Education was ammunition, Mary understood, and she was arming a revolution one lesson at a time. How long could they maintain this dangerous charade before someone discovered what they were really doing? The school was just the beginning, just the surface layer of an operation that would eventually stretch across state lines and cost Mary everything. As she taught children their letters, Mary was also conducting a different kind of education, identifying which enslaved people were ready to run, which had the courage and desperation required to risk everything for freedom, which could be trusted with the secret that would eventually make the Meachum name synonymous with liberation. She developed an uncanny ability to read people, to spot the spark of rebellion behind carefully maintained masks of subservience, to find the ones who would rather die free than live enslaved. And when she found them, she whispered words that must have sounded like prophecy. "There is a way out, and I can show you." The Underground Railroad wasn't really a railroad, of course. It was a loose network of safe houses, secret routes, and brave souls willing to risk their own freedom to liberate others. In St. Louis, that network ran directly through Mary and John Meachum's home, and Mary was its conductor, its engineer, its beating heart. Runaways arrived in the dead of night, terrified and starving, bearing scars on their bodies and trauma in their eyes. Mary fed them, clothed them, and most importantly, gave them something more precious than bread. She gave them hope, strategy, and a concrete plan for reaching the free territories to the north and west. But the Mississippi River posed a seemingly insurmountable problem. The river was miles wide, patrolled by slave catchers and bounty hunters, monitored by authorities who grew rich on rewards for captured runaways. Crossing it meant certain capture for those who tried to swim or hire passage on legitimate vessels where questions would be asked and papers demanded. For years, the Mississippi had been the ultimate barrier, the line between captivity and potential freedom that seemed impossible to cross. Enslaved people in Missouri could see Illinois across the water, could literally see freedom, but couldn't reach it. The proximity of liberation made the impossibility of achieving it all the more cruel, and Mary Meachum stared at that river every day, her formidable mind working on a problem that seemed to have no solution. Then, sometime in the late 1830s, Mary had an idea so audacious, so brilliantly simple, that it would change everything. What if the solution wasn't to hide from the river, but to use it? The ferry to freedom. Mary Meachum understood something fundamental about oppression. It depends on the oppressed staying in their designated place, following the rules, accepting the boundaries imposed upon them. The slave system worked because enslaved people were supposed to be immobile, trapped on their plantations, unable to navigate the geography of their own imprisonment. But Mary had never been good at staying where she was supposed to be, and she saw in the Mississippi River not a barrier, but an opportunity, a highway to freedom that was hiding in plain sight. The ferry operation began small, cautious, with Mary using the skills she'd developed over years of subterfuge. She started by acquiring a small boat, nothing fancy, just a simple vessel that could be rowed across the river without attracting attention. The genius of Mary's plan was its simplicity. She wouldn't try to hide what she was doing, but would disguise it as something ordinary, something beneath the notice of the white authorities who considered black labor so mundane as to be invisible. A black woman ferrying people across the river for a few coins? That was just commerce, just another enslaved or free black person doing menial work for whites too important to row themselves. Except Mary wasn't just ferrying anyone. She was ferrying the enslaved to freedom, right under the slaveholders' noses. The logistics were incredibly complex and required split-second timing, absolute discretion, and nerves of steel. Mary would receive word through the network, coded messages delivered by trusted intermediaries about enslaved people ready to run. She would arrange meeting points along the riverbank, usually in the darkest hours before dawn when patrol vigilance was lowest and fog often hung over the water like a protective blanket. The runaways would arrive terrified, certain they were walking into a trap, unable to believe that this middle-aged black woman with the steady eyes and gentle voice was really going to save them. Mary would settle them into her boat with practiced efficiency, covering them with tarps or making them lie flat in the bottom of the vessel. And then she would row. Hours of back-breaking labor, fighting the Mississippi's powerful current, navigating by starlight and intimate knowledge of the river's moods. Illinois' shore represented the first taste of freedom, though it was tenuous, dangerous, and required constant vigilance. Mary couldn't simply drop people off and leave them. She had to connect them with the next link in the Underground Railroad chain, had to ensure they had supplies and directions and the knowledge they needed to keep moving north. She memorized routes and safe houses, committed to memory the names of allies in towns scattered across Illinois who could be trusted to continue the work she'd begun. Every crossing was an act of war against the slave system, every successful delivery a victory that no newspaper would report, no history book would initially record. Between 1837 and 1841, Mary Meachum ferried dozens, perhaps hundreds, of enslaved people across the Mississippi River to freedom, and the slaveholders couldn't figure out how they were escaping. But the more successful Mary became, the closer danger crept, and it was only a matter of time before her luck ran out. The slave economy of Missouri was hemorrhaging value as enslaved people kept vanishing, and the slaveholders were furious. They knew someone was helping, knew there had to be a network, but their fundamental racism prevented them from seeing the truth. They couldn't conceive that a black woman, someone they considered barely human, could be orchestrating an operation this sophisticated. They suspected white abolitionists, looked for northern agitators, investigated fellow slaveholders who might be running a side business, stealing and reselling enslaved people. The possibility that Mary Meachum, that respectable, free black woman who ran a school and attended church and seemed so docile, so proper, could be the architect of their losses. It simply didn't compute in their white supremacist brains. But eventually, inevitably, someone talked. Maybe they were tortured into confession. Maybe they were offered freedom in exchange for names. Maybe they simply broke under the psychological weight of what they knew. However it happened, by early 1841, whispers started circulating through St. Louis's white community that the Meachums were involved in something illegal, something that involved enslaved people disappearing and the river crossing that shouldn't be happening. The authorities began watching the Meachum home more carefully, paying attention to the nocturnal visitors, noting the unusual traffic patterns. Mary felt the noose tightening, knew that the end of her operation was approaching, but she couldn't stop, wouldn't stop, because there were still people in chains, still souls crying out for liberation. On May 21st, 1841, Mary Meachum prepared for what would be her final crossing, though she didn't know it yet. Could she possibly escape what was coming, or had her legendary luck finally run out? The spring night was thick with humidity, the kind of oppressive heat that made even breathing feel like labor. Mary had received word about a group, larger than usual, perhaps 9 or 10 souls, who were ready to make the run. It was risky taking so many at once, but these were desperate people who had reached the breaking point where death seemed preferable to one more day of bondage. Mary agreed to the crossing, prepared her boat, and sent word about the meeting point on the riverbank north of the city, where prying eyes would be fewer. She moved through her preparations with the calm efficiency of experience, checking her oars, ensuring the boat was sound, packing the supplies her passengers would need on the other side. But the authorities were watching, had been watching for weeks, and they were finally ready to spring their trap. Mary reached the designated meeting point to find her passengers already assembled. 9 enslaved people, ranging in age from teenagers to middle-aged adults, all carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and in desperate hunger for freedom. They looked at Mary with eyes that mixed hope and terror in equal measure, and she gave them the same reassuring nod she'd given so many others, the gesture that said, "I've got you, you're going to make it." She began loading them into her boat, working quickly but carefully, aware that every second they remained on Missouri's shore was a second they could be discovered and dragged back to unspeakable punishment. That's when the torches appeared on the riverbank, when the shouts rang out, when Mary Meachum realized with sickening clarity that they had been betrayed. Law enforcement officers and slave catchers swarmed the shore like locusts, surrounding Mary's boat before she could even attempt to push off. The enslaved people in her boat cried out in anguish, knowing what awaited them: the whip, the branding iron, possibly sailed to the deep south where conditions were even more nightmarish than Missouri. Mary stood in her boat, facing down the mob of angry white men with a dignity that must have been infuriating to them, refusing to cower, refusing to apologize for the crime of believing black people deserved freedom. They arrested her on the spot, seized her boat, and triumphantly dragged their captives back into the hell of slavery. The newspapers reported Mary Meachum's arrest with gleeful viciousness, celebrating the capture of the Negro woman who had been helping slaves escape. The trial was a farce, a performance of justice where the verdict was predetermined, and Mary's guilt was never in question. She was charged with enticing slaves to run away, a crime that carried severe penalties because it struck at the economic foundation of the slave system. The prosecution painted Mary as a criminal, a troublemaker, a threat to the social order, conveniently ignoring the fact that the real crime was the institution of slavery itself, the legal framework that treated human beings as merchandise. But here's where Mary Meachum's story takes a turn that the slaveholders never saw coming. She had resources they didn't anticipate, a community that wouldn't let her fall, and a husband who understood exactly how to manipulate the legal system that had tried to destroy them. How would Mary escape the justice system designed to crush black resistance? The trial and the strategy. The St. Louis courthouse in the summer of 1841 was a theater of oppression dressed up as jurisprudence, where black lives were adjudicated by white men who had financial stakes in maintaining slavery. Mary Meachum sat in that courtroom, surrounded by hostile faces, and she must have understood that the trial itself was beside the point. The verdict had been decided before she ever entered the building. The prosecution presented their evidence, testimony from the captured enslaved people who had been tortured into confession, statements from the arresting officers, documentation of Mary's boat and her presence at the riverbank. The case against her was airtight by the standards of a legal system designed to protect property rights over human rights. But John Barry Meachum wasn't about to let his wife be sacrificed to Missouri's barbaric laws without a fight. John had been navigating the treacherous waters of race and law for decades, had learned how to exploit every loophole, how to leverage his property ownership and free status to gain access to systems usually closed to black people. He hired lawyers, white lawyers because black people couldn't practice law, and began constructing a defense that was as much about strategy as justice. The legal argument was technical, focused on procedural issues and questions about the evidence. But the real defense was happening outside the courtroom, in the conversations John was having with influential members of the white community who owed him money or favors, who depended on his business or respected his church. Mary's status as a free woman complicated the prosecution's case in ways they hadn't anticipated. She wasn't enslaved property that could be simply disposed of, and killing or imprisoning a free black person required at least the appearance of legal procedure. The trial dragged on through the sweltering summer, and with each passing day, the community's attention began to shift. St. Louis's free black community rallied around Mary, attending the trial in numbers that made the white authorities nervous, showing up as silent witnesses to injustice who couldn't be ignored. White abolitionists, though few in number in Missouri, also began making noise, writing letters to newspapers, questioning whether Missouri really wanted to be known as the state that imprisoned a woman for the crime of believing in freedom. The verdict, when it finally came, was guilty, but the sentence was surprisingly lenient. Mary was fined and sentenced to a brief jail term rather than the years of imprisonment or physical punishment she might have received. Historians have debated why the sentence was so relatively light, with theories ranging from John's behind-the-scenes maneuvering to the authorities' fear of making Mary a martyr. But the result was that after a few months, Mary Meachum walked out of that jail, bruised but unbroken, and immediately resumed her work. Because you can't imprison the idea of freedom, can't jail the commitment to liberation, can't sentence away the belief that all people deserve to control their own lives. Mary's arrest and trial had been intended to destroy her, to make an example that would terrify other would-be freedom fighters into submission. Instead, it made her famous, turned her into a symbol of resistance that inspired others to take up the work. The slave system wanted Mary to disappear into obscurity, to be forgotten, to serve as a cautionary tale about what happens to black people who step out of line. They failed completely, because Mary Meachum refused to be erased, refused to accept that her story would end in defeat. When she emerged from jail, she was more committed than ever to the cause of liberation, and though her ferrying days were over, the authorities were watching too closely now. She found other ways to fight. The Meachum home continued to serve as a safe house for runaways, though now the operation had to be even more covert, even more carefully orchestrated. Mary's school continued teaching black children not just reading and writing, but history and dignity, and the truth that they were fully human despite what the slaveholders claimed. John's church became a center of abolitionist organizing, a place where information was shared, strategies were developed, and the Underground Railroad's St. Louis operations were coordinated. Mary and John worked in tandem, two brilliant minds united in purpose, understanding that the fight for freedom was going to be long and costly, but absolutely necessary. The years between Mary's trial and the Civil War were marked by escalating tensions as the nation hurtled toward its inevitable reckoning with slavery. Mary watched as the Dred Scott decision declared that black people had no rights. White people were bound to respect, watched as John Brown raided Harper's Ferry and was executed for daring to take up arms against slavery, watched as the country tore itself apart over the question of whether human beings could be owned. Through it all, Mary continued her work, older now, her body bearing the marks of decades of struggle, but her commitment as fierce as ever. What would become of Mary's legacy, and would she live to see the freedom she had fought for become reality? The war and the transformation. When the Civil War finally erupted in 1861, Mary Meachum was in her mid-40s, a veteran of decades of guerrilla warfare against slavery, who had been waiting her entire life for this confrontation. The war transformed St. Louis overnight, from a border city trying to maintain neutrality into a Union stronghold surrounded by Confederate sympathizers, a place where neighbor turned against neighbor and violence simmered constantly beneath the surface. For enslaved people in Missouri, the war created chaos and opportunity in equal measure. The old systems of control were breaking down, slaveholders were distracted and frightened, and the possibility of liberation seemed suddenly, tantalizingly close. Mary's work during the war years evolved to meet the changing circumstances. Enslaved people were fleeing to Union lines in massive numbers, seeking the freedom that Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had theoretically granted them in Confederate territories, though Missouri as a border state was initially excluded from its provisions. These refugees needed everything: food, shelter, clothing, medical care, education, job training, and most of all, they needed guidance on how to navigate freedom after a lifetime of bondage. Mary and John threw themselves into this work with the same energy they'd brought to the Underground Railroad, transforming their church and home into a relief center for the formerly enslaved. The conditions were desperate, overwhelming, heartbreaking. People arrived sick and starving, bearing the physical and psychological wounds of slavery, traumatized by their experiences, but also filled with a hope that Mary recognized because she'd carried it herself. She worked tirelessly, her days stretching from before dawn until long after dark, feeding hundreds, teaching dozens, counseling countless souls who were trying to figure out what freedom actually meant in practical terms. The work was harder than ferrying people across the river had been, because now she wasn't just facilitating escape, she was helping build the infrastructure of freedom itself, helping people transition from being property to being citizens. John Mary Meachum died in 1854, before the war began, leaving Mary to continue their shared work alone. His death must have been devastating, the loss of her partner in both love and resistance, but Mary didn't have the luxury of extended grief. There was too much work to do, too many people depending on her, and she pushed forward with the same determination that had defined her entire life. She was a widow now, an older woman in a society that rarely valued black women at any age, but she was also a legend, a name whispered with reverence in the black community as one of the great freedom fighters of her generation. Missouri finally abolished slavery in 1865, and the 13th Amendment made that abolition nationwide. Mary Meachum lived to see the institution that had defined and deformed her entire life finally, legally, officially die. What that moment must have felt like is almost impossible to imagine. The weight of decades of struggle, the memory of every person she'd ferried across the river, the faces of those she couldn't save, the knowledge that the impossible thing she'd fought for had actually happened. Freedom had come, not because slaveholders had experienced a moral awakening, but because enslaved people and their allies had fought for it, had risked and sacrificed and died for it, had made the continuation of slavery more costly than its abolition. But freedom on paper didn't automatically translate to freedom in reality, and Mary's work was far from over. The long aftermath, the Reconstruction era, brought new challenges that Mary and other formerly enslaved people had to navigate with the same intelligence and strategy they'd applied to escaping bondage. Freedom meant the legal right to own property, to marry, to keep families together, to move without passes, to control one's own labor. But it didn't mean equality, didn't mean safety, didn't mean the end of white supremacist violence. The same people who had fought to preserve slavery simply adapted their tactics, using terror and legal manipulation to maintain as much of the old racial hierarchy as possible. Black codes restricted freedom of movement and contract. Vagrancy laws forced black people into exploitative labor arrangements that resembled slavery in everything but name. And vigilante violence punished those who dared to assert their rights. Mary continued teaching, continued organizing, continued being a pillar of St. Louis's black community through the turbulent years after the war. She worked with the Freedmen's Bureau when it operated in Missouri, helping newly freed people access the resources they were legally entitled to, but that local officials tried to deny them. She advocated for black education, understanding that literacy and knowledge were forms of power that could never be taken away once acquired. She mentored younger activists, passing down the strategies and wisdom she'd accumulated over a lifetime of resistance, ensuring that the next generation would be equipped to continue the fight for genuine equality. The specific date of Mary Meachum's death is lost to history, one of countless details about black lives that a white supremacist society didn't bother to record. We know she lived at least into the late 1860s, that she spent her final years as a respected elder in the community she had served so courageously that she died free, legally, officially free, which had once seemed like an impossible dream. Her grave's location is unknown, her final resting place unmarked. A tragic testament to how thoroughly history can erase those it deems unimportant. But Mary Meachum's legacy couldn't be erased, even when the dominant culture tried to forget her. How did a woman whose grave is unknown leave such an indelible mark on history? The legacy and the remembering. For decades after her death, Mary Meachum's story was preserved not in history books or official records, but in the oral traditions of black communities, in stories passed from grandparents to grandchildren, in the collective memory of a people who understood the importance of remembering their freedom fighters. Her name became synonymous with courage in St. Louis's black community, invoked as inspiration when the struggle for civil rights continued, through the Jim Crow era, through the civil rights movement, through every subsequent fight for racial justice. The specific details might have been lost or distorted over time, but the essential truth remained. Mary Meachum had risked everything to free her people, had outsmarted the slave system, had ferried souls across the river to liberation. Modern historians and activists have worked to recover Mary's story, to piece together the documentary evidence that confirms what the oral traditions always maintained. Records of her arrest and trial still exist in courthouse archives. Newspaper accounts of her activities survive in the yellowed pages of 19th-century periodicals, and the ferry operation she ran has been verified through multiple sources. In recent decades, Mary Meachum has been recognized with historical markers, commemorative events, and educational programs that ensure new generations learn about her contributions. The riverbank where she once launched her boat now bears her name, a small gesture toward historical justice for a woman who deserves national recognition but remains largely unknown outside of Missouri. Mary's story resonates today because the themes of her life remain painfully relevant. The fight against systemic oppression, the courage required to resist unjust laws, the intelligence and creativity that oppressed people employ to survive and resist, the power of individual action to create systemic change. In an era when refugees still risk everything to cross waters seeking safety, when borders are militarized and people are criminalized for the act of migration, when systems of oppression continue to separate families and deny humanity, Mary Meachum's story asks us to consider where we stand, what risks we're willing to take, whose freedom we're willing to fight for. The boat Mary rowed across the Mississippi was small and simple, powered by nothing more than her strong arms and indomitable will, but it carried an entire world of possibility. Each crossing was an act of faith, a declaration that black lives mattered, that freedom was worth any risk, that the system that claimed black people were property was a lie that could be defeated through courage and strategy. Mary Meachum understood what every freedom fighter throughout history has understood, that liberation is not granted by oppressors, but seized by the oppressed, that waiting for permission to be human is futile, that sometimes the only moral choice is to break unjust laws and face the consequences. The meditation on freedom. Freedom is not a destination, but a continuous act of creation, something that must be built and defended and reimagined with each generation. Mary Meachum knew this truth in her bones, understood that crossing the Mississippi River was just the beginning of a longer journey, that legal emancipation was just one step in a struggle that would continue long after her death. The freedom she fought for wasn't merely the absence of chains, but the presence of dignity, the ability to make choices about one's own life, to love without fear of separation, to work without being exploited, to exist in the world as a full human being rather than someone else's property. When we remember Mary Meachum today, we're not engaging in nostalgia or ancestor worship, but in a necessary act of historical reckoning. Her story demands that we confront the truth about American history, about the institution of slavery that was this nation's original sin and its economic foundation, about the resistance that enslaved people mounted against their dehumanization, about the complexity and courage of black lives that have been systematically erased from mainstream historical narratives. Mary's intelligence, her strategic brilliance, her unwavering commitment to liberation, these qualities destabilize the racist myths that were created to justify slavery, myths that portrayed black people as passive, unintelligent, content with bondage. The Mississippi River still flows through St. Louis, indifferent to the human dramas that have played out on its shores, carrying water from the northern reaches of the continent down to the Gulf of Mexico, just as it did when Mary Meachum pushed her boat away from the Missouri shore. But that river means something different now, carries different weight, because of what Mary did there. Geography becomes sacred when transformed by acts of courage, and the stretch of water where Mary ferried the enslaved to freedom is holy ground, a place where the desperate hope for liberation was made manifest through the determination of one extraordinary woman. Mary Meachum's hands must have been calloused and strong from years of rowing, marked by the physical labor that defined her entire life. First as an enslaved person, then as a freedom fighter who literally pulled her people toward liberation. Those hands taught children to write, prepared food for refugees, gripped oars that cut through the Mississippi's powerful current. They were hands that built freedom, one crossing at a time, that refused to accept the boundaries imposed by slavery, that reached out to pull others into the boat and toward the possibility of self-determination. We should remember those hands, honor them, and ask ourselves what our own hands are building. What boundaries we're willing to cross, what risks we're prepared to take for others' liberation. The story of Mary Meachum is ultimately about the indomitable nature of the human spirit, about the fact that systems of oppression, no matter how total they seem, contain within them the seeds of their own destruction, because they can never fully crush the hunger for freedom. Every enslaved person who ran was an act of rebellion. Every conductor on the Underground Railroad was a revolutionary. Every crossing of the river was a small war won against an evil system. Mary Meachum understood that her individual actions mattered, that she couldn't free everyone, but that didn't mean she shouldn't free anyone, that the work of liberation is done one person at a time, one crossing at a time, one act of courage at a time. Her legacy lives not just in the people she directly freed, but in their descendants, in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who exist because Mary Meachum refused to accept that black people were destined for permanent bondage. Entire family trees exist because of her courage, entire lineages that trace back to that moment when someone's ancestor climbed into Mary's boat and took the most dangerous journey of their lives. Those descendants may not know Mary's name, may not be aware that they owe their very existence to her bravery. But the debt is real. The connection is unbreakable. The impact of her actions echoes through generations. The final reflection. In the end, what do we do with a story like Mary Meachum's? How do we hold the weight of such courage, such sacrifice, such an extraordinary commitment to human freedom? We remember, first and foremost, we refuse to let her story be erased. Refuse to participate in the historical amnesia that has buried too many black heroes and heroines. We teach our children about Mary Meachum alongside the names they learn in school. We visit the historical markers that bear her name. We support the historians and educators and activists who are working to recover and preserve these essential narratives. But remembering isn't enough. Mary's story demands action. Demands that we ask ourselves what systems of oppression exist in our own time, what equivalents to slavery persist under different names, who is being denied their humanity and freedom today. It asks us to consider what risks we're willing to take, what comfort we're willing to sacrifice, what consequences we're prepared to face in the service of justice. Mary Meachum didn't have the luxury of performative activism or #solidarity. She literally put her life on the line every time she pushed her boat away from shore, and she did it anyway because the alternative was unacceptable. The water of the Mississippi River that Mary navigated is the same water that flows today, connecting past to present, carrying the memory of all those crossings, all those desperate hopes, all those acts of resistance. When you stand on the banks of that river in St. Louis, when you watch the water flow endlessly southward, you are standing in the presence of history, in a place consecrated by courage. You are standing where enslaved people took their first steps toward freedom, where a black woman defied an entire system of oppression, where the impossible was made real through determination and strategy and love. Mary Meachum's life teaches us that one person can make a difference, that ordinary people can perform extraordinary acts, that the arc of history doesn't bend toward justice on its own, but must be pulled and dragged and forced in that direction by those willing to fight for it. She was born into slavery, died free, and in between those 2 points, she changed the world for dozens or hundreds of people who would otherwise have remained in bondage. That's not a small legacy. That's not an insignificant life. That's a revolution fought one crossing at a time, a war won through intelligence and courage rather than armies and weapons. So we honor Mary Meachum not with pity or sorrow, but with recognition of her brilliance, her strength, her refusal to be broken by a system designed to destroy her. We honor her by continuing the work she began, by fighting contemporary forms of oppression with the same intelligence and determination she demonstrated. We honor her by refusing to forget, by passing her story down to future generations, by ensuring that the name Mary Meachum becomes synonymous with courage and resistance and the unbreakable human commitment to freedom. The boat is long gone, rotted away or destroyed, but the journey continues. The river still flows, still divides and connects, still carries the weight of history in its waters. And somewhere in the collective memory of American history, in the stories that matter most, even when they're not the ones most often told, Mary Meachum rose on, ferrying souls toward liberation, proving that the human spirit cannot be permanently enslaved, that freedom will always find a way, that resistance is possible even in the darkest circumstances. She was a teacher, a conductor, a revolutionary, a hero. She was Mary Meachum, the enslaved woman who ran a secret ferry, and her story is America's story, the story of oppression and resistance, of dehumanization and determination, of a nation's greatest shame and its most inspiring heroes. May we remember her name, honor her legacy, and commit ourselves to the ongoing work of freedom that she fought for so courageously. May we be worthy of the sacrifices she made, the risks she took, the extraordinary life she lived in service of liberation. And may we never forget that the most dangerous crossing isn't over water, but through our own fear, and that on the other side of that crossing lies the possibility of a more just world, waiting for those brave enough to make the journey. That is Mary Meachum's gift to us, not just her story, but the challenge her story presents, the question it asks of everyone who encounters it. When your moment comes, when the choice presents itself between safety and justice, between comfort and courage, between accepting oppression and fighting it, what will you choose? Mary Meachum chose freedom, chose resistance, chose to risk everything for the liberation of her people. Her boat may be gone, but the crossing continues, and we are all called to pick up the oars and row toward the freedom that she fought for, died believing in, and helped to create through the force of her indomitable will. Remember her name. Honor her courage. Continue her work. That is how we keep Mary Meachum's boat afloat, how we ensure that the ferry to freedom she created never stops running, how we transform memory into action and history into justice. The river flows on, and so must we, guided by her example, inspired by her courage, committed to the freedom she believed all people deserved. That is the legacy of Mary Meachum, the enslaved woman who became a liberator, the property who became a revolutionary, the woman who looked at the Mississippi River and saw not a barrier but a bridge to freedom.